The president talked about compromise. Does he have a new plan for compromise?
Well, both plans are in Congress now. The Senate plan and the House plan contain a lot of the elements of the work that he and the Vice President did with members of Congress. So a lot of the spending cuts are ones that we helped identify. So the question now is, we've got spending cuts on the table that I think both parties can largely agree to. So the House Republicans are just going to have to stop engaging in kind of a my way or the highway approach and try and seek common ground here. And if we do that, then it's clear no matter what plan passes over the next 7 days, we're still not going to tackle the tough things of entitlement reform or tax reform. That's going to be in the months ahead. But this can be a good down payment. Both parties can come together and take the threat of default off the table, put a good down payment on deficit reduction in place, and then move on to how we reduce the deficit in the longer term.
If the Boehner plan fails in the House and the Reid plan fails in the Senate, what is Plan B?
Well, you have both of those plans have a lot of agreement. You know, you've got a lot of the same spending cuts. They both establish a committee to try and identify additional deficit reduction and tax and entitlement reform. The real difference is the House Republicans are insisting that we go through this exercise again 5 or 6 months from now. And I think anyone who's watched this, any of your viewers, understand that would not be a good thing for the country. So we do not want to put our economy through that again. So we ought to be able to reduce the deficit, set up a process to identify more savings, the kind of things that the President was talking to the Speaker about, entitlement reform, tax reform. That would be the right thing to do for the country.
But that's not in either of these plans. I mean, that's not really in either of these plans. I mean, honestly, if the Boehner plan collapses and the Reid plan collapses, then doesn't the President have to come forward then with a new solution? What are you guys planning on doing?
Well, both of these plans, again, have a great amount of similarity. The House Republicans are insisting that even though you're beginning to see commentators in the business community saying that a short-term debt ceiling increase, where you have the prospect of this exercise again a few months down the road, is not going to be good for our economy. So they need to drop that insistence. We need to agree on the deficit reduction. We need to agree on a process for additional deficit reduction in the areas of tax and entitlement reform. If we do that, we can make sure we don't default, and then Congress can get to the work of making sure that we come together on both the tax and entitlement reform. So compromise here is not hard. You're not talking about something that's miles and miles apart.
So the Boehner plan can be a vehicle then in the Senate?
Well, not as it exists. That's clear. The Boehner plan, first of all, there's not the kind of proper, you need some firewall between defense and non-defense spending. So all the cuts don't fall disproportionately on things like education and medical research. But the Boehner plan has at its core this notion that we should have another process 5 or 6 months from now, where the whole country again is kind of brought to a halt as politicians in Washington debate this debt limit. That's not good for the country. And I think that's something that most people understand. And so that's really where the House Republicans need to compromise.
A primetime address to the country is an extraordinary opportunity for the President to reach millions and millions of Americans. Why not use that opportunity to lay out exactly what the President's plan is? Why hasn't the President been clear about exactly what he wants?
Well, Nora, I would take objection to that. I think on your network, your viewers have, over the last few months, been exposed to what the President wants to do. Specifically, the kind of tax reform he'd engage in, the entitlement reform, spending cuts. Last Friday in his press conference, he laid that out in great detail.
Why not hand it on a sheet of paper like this so that the American people can see it?
Well,
if you believe so firmly in what the President is proposing, a compromise that both Democrats and Republicans can agree on, why not put it on one sheet of paper exactly what those proposals are?
Well, listen, the people of America are very clear where the President stands, and they stand with him. Okay, we put out about 5 or 6 months ago our framework for deficit reduction. It provided the framework for a lot of the discussions we had with Speaker Boehner. So people understand we want to make sure we reform the tax code, close loopholes so the wealthiest and big corporations contribute. We're going to do historic amounts of domestic spending cuts, entitlement reforms in areas of Medicare, and it's been reported the President's willing to look at things like raising the retirement age in Medicare, additional savings in Medicare, even willing to look at some adjustments in Social Security down the line. So we've been very clear, and I think the American people are clear about the approach they want, which is a balanced approach. Now, in this short term, in the next week, we're not going to solve our deficit problem, that's clear. Congress is going to need more time to do their work on things like entitlement reform and tax reform. But at the very least, we can remove the threat of default, and we can make a significant down payment on deficit reduction with more work to come.
The President insisted from the podium before the American people that there was no changing of the goalposts. And yet, after trying to stick to $1.2 trillion in increased revenues, and after hearing from the Speaker that that was not acceptable, then Boehner walked away from the table. And then the President the next day called him and said, fine, I'm willing to go back to $800 billion. Was that a lost opportunity then? And why didn't the President think that the Speaker was willing to accept that?
Well, no, we didn't move our goalposts. We had been having very specific discussions. And the President said, you know, in a negotiation, obviously, the whole complexion of the package is important. And we were very clear that, you know, additional revenues might be needed if you were going to really ramp up the entitlement savings. But we were comfortable with the package. And the President made this clear to the Speaker. That's the tragedy, is what the country needs, and I think we'll eventually get. Because you see Republicans in the Senate, the Speaker of the House, to his credit, was willing to work on this approach, which is anyone who's serious about the deficit understands it can't all be spending cuts geared towards the middle class and seniors.
Can you answer the charge that some people sort of look at, especially what happened with the President's primetime address and then a response by Speaker Boehner, that it was a lot of the blame game going on? There was a lot of political speech making to just sort of CYA for when this whole thing does go down and whoever wins or loses. Is that what this was about? Why make a political speech? Why not make a policy speech about exactly what the President's plan is?
Well, I think people watching that speech last night were very clear where the President stands, which is he thinks we need a balanced approach that asks something of everybody, that's not going to endanger our economy. And what the President did in that speech talked often about compromise. Something, by the way, that word was not used by John Boehner. Unfortunately, in Washington today, people think compromise is a dirty word. It's what's required. Another thing is the President asked the American people, if you're interested in compromise, if you're interested in a balanced approach, call your Congress people, email them. And Capitol Hill's been flooded with people who are tired of the posturing and want their leaders to compromise.
You're one of the President's top political advisors. Would you consider it a political defeat if this President ends up signing a debt ceiling increase that does not include new tax revenues or does not address closing the loopholes for corporate jet owners or even address tax reform in a meaningful way?
Well, as I said, this is going to be, even the discussion we're having with Speaker Boehner is going to be a two-step process where you're going to have some savings identified up front and in those areas like closing tax loopholes in terms of entitled reform.
You're having a conversation with Boehner?
In the negotiations we're having with the Speaker.
Now you are in negotiations with the Speaker right now?
Well, the ones we were having that broke down last week was always going to be a two-step process on deficit reduction.
But that's done. The Speaker said that's dead.
Well, my point is, whatever gets done, in all likelihood, is going to have some savings up front, which is largely going to be in spending cuts domestically. Things like entitlement reform, tax reform, closing loopholes, those are going to be worked on in Congress over the months ahead. So what we're focused on is ultimately, over the next 5 or 6 months, we need to get through this debt ceiling period, again, get a good down payment on deficit reduction, then Congress is going to go off and work on can they come to agreement on entitlement reform and tax reform. And we will insist when that process is done that it has to be balanced. That all the burden doesn't fall disproportionately on one segment of our society.
Finally, is the President still speaking with Speaker Boehner?
The President continues to talk to leaders in both chambers and both parties, as do members of his administration.
Has he spoken with the Speaker since Sunday?
Well, I'm not going to get into their specific discussions, but you know, we communicate frequently with leaders in both chambers and both parties. Everybody understands. The good news for America is all the leaders have said unequivocally, privately and publicly, that they're not going to default to the United States. Now, we have to make sure we get the kind of compromise that will allow that to happen. The other thing I'd say just optimistically, that this is a rare moment in Washington where you see members of both parties, leaders of both parties, saying, we believe we need to do deficit reduction. People generally agree we need to ultimately get $4 trillion. We actually agree on major components of it. But there's
only a very small group, but those are not even what's being considered in the House or Senate right now.
Well, no, but there is. You see a lot of bipartisan support in the Senate for a balanced approach. In the House, even though Democrats and Republicans may have differences on things like entitlement reform and tax reform, you see people having a common desire to reduce the deficit and believe it's got to be done to the tune of about $4 trillion. So these are tough discussions. There's tough disagreements. But at the end of the day, Washington needs to see this moment. And so in the next week, what we need to do is do what we can to reduce the deficit, make sure we don't default, make sure that doesn't hang over our economy. But again, this play is not over then. because there still is more work to be done in things like tax reform and entitlement reform.
So why not then agree to a two-step process like Boehner's? If you're willing
Well,
to sort of put it off to a two-step process, and why not agree to what
his
what
two-step
Boehner-
process is with the debt ceiling hanging over our economy. Okay, we're not going to do that. It's irresponsible and reckless. But what we ought to do is get through this period of the next week, and then let's figure out over the next 5 or 6 months, can we come to agreement in a bipartisan way for additional deficit reduction, which I think we all agree is what the country needs.
Okay. So is there a plan B?
The plan B is you need to compromise. And listen, there's a lot of discussion on Capitol Hill today. Again, what's in the Senate and what's in the House, there's quite a bit of commonality there. So we just need folks on Capitol Hill to compromise, and I expect that they will over the coming days.